Hello and welcome to Science Tutors YouTube channel and today's Anatomy and Physiology mini review. My name is Professor Dodge and today's topic will be the blood flow through the heart. So let's get started with that tutorial on blood flow through the heart. Okay, so the blood flow through the four chambers of the heart. And that's what you can see right here, this illustration. We have what we call a coronal section showing you the interior of the heart. We have four chambers, four complete separate chambers. You can see here the top two thin-walled chambers are referred to as the atria. The singular term is atrium. So we have two atria. These receive the blood from large veins. Remember, veins return blood to the heart under relatively low pressure. That blood is returned to the top two chambers here called the atria. Relatively thin walls are indicative of the fact that these chambers are just receiving chambers. Most of the blood that enters the top two atria will passively flow into the inferior or the bottom two larger chambers called the ventricles. If we look here, we can see these have relatively thick walls. And again, that's because the two ventricles are going to pump the blood through the large arteries. Remember, arteries will carry blood away from the heart. So to sum it up, we have four chambers. We have two receiving chambers called atria, relatively thin walls, and we have two inferior chambers called the ventricles, which have a relatively thick wall because, again, they're responsible for pumping the blood away from the heart. We look here, this slide is to remind you that while there are four chambers of the heart actually functions as two separate pumps. It is a double pump. It is made up of two circuits. On the right side, right, if we look at this heart in the anatomical position, this would be the right side. Over here, this would be the left side. The right side of the heart is the pulmonary circuit. Its job is to pump blood that's low in oxygen to the lungs. And of course, the point of carrying that blood to the lungs is to pick up oxygen. So now the oxygenated blood will return to the other side, to the left side of the heart. That is part of the systemic circuit. So the left side, the systemic circuit, will pump that blood to all of the systems. So again, it should be fairly easy to remember. Right is pulmonary, pumping to the lungs. Left is systemic circuit, pumping to the systems. And again, if you remember, the coloring here is key. The blue is indicative of blood that's low in O2, while red indicates blood that is high in oxygen. The blood that is low in O2 is pumped to the lungs to pick up that oxygen. It is then returned to the opposite side of the heart. As the blood is now filled with oxygen, it'll get pumped to all of the systems. So again, while we have four separate chambers, we technically have two separate pumps. Right side is the pulmonary circuit, left side of the heart is the systemic circuit. Again, if you remember from previous tutorials, the large vessels that carry blood to and from the heart are basically arteries and veins. Veins are the thin-walled vessels that return blood to the heart. They're returning blood under low pressure, so it's okay that their walls are relatively thin. We have two major veins returning blood to the heart. On the right side, we have this large vessel called the vena cava. It's divided into two parts. We have the part that drains the upper body. We call it the superior vena cava, and the lower portion is the inferior vena cava. So the vena cava is the vein that returns oxygen-poor blood to the right side of the heart. And then if we look on the left side here, we see that we have two pairs of pulmonary veins. This set is coming from the left lung, and the set over here is coming from the right lung. Both sets of pulmonary veins, again, thin-walled vessels that return blood to the heart, are going to return the blood to the left side of the heart. Okay? So the veins return the blood to the heart, and the thicker-walled arteries will carry the blood away from the heart, and arteries have to have thicker walls because the blood leaving the heart is under high pressure. So again, the blood leaving the right ventricle will pass through this pulmonary artery and carry the blood away to the lungs. And the blood that's going to be squeezed out of this left ventricle will be carried away through this large artery called the aorta, and that will carry the blood to all of the systems. Those are the four major vessels, the arteries and veins, that are carrying blood to and from the heart. When we look here at the internal structure of the heart, there's really four more structures that we need to discuss when we talk about blood flow through the heart, and those are the valves. We have four valves, and the point of these valves is to always keep the blood flowing in one direction and prevent what we call backflow or regurgitation of blood. And typically we study these valves in pairs. So we have the two AV valves, atrioventricular valves, and these are located between the atria and the ventricles. So here we look on the right side. We can see the AV valve here is made up of 1, 2, 3 flaps. So often this valve is also referred to as the tricuspid valve. And on the left side, we can see the other atrioventricular or AV valve. And this one is made up of 2 flaps. And so this is called the bicuspid, or it's also referred to as the mitral valve. So this one has 3 names. This can be the left AV valve, the bicuspid, or the mitral. And over here, we have the right AV valve, or we call it the tricuspid. These flaps really are like swinging doors. And so when they're closed, that separates the atrium from the ventricle, atrium from the ventricle. But when blood is returned to the heart as it fills in the atria, the pressure of that blood causes those flaps to swing open, just like a swinging door would when you push on it. Here, the blood is like pushing on those flaps, and they open, and blood can then flow passively into the ventricle. When the ventricles start to squeeze so that they can pump the blood away from the heart through these arteries, we need to ensure that the blood doesn't squirt backwards, right, up into the atria. And so when those ventricles start to contract, that's the signal for the AV valves to close. They snap shut, and therefore the blood does not go backwards into the atria, but instead, from the right ventricle, that blood will be directed through the pulmonary artery, and from the left ventricle, that blood gets directed here through the aorta. So the AV valves prevent backflow of blood from the ventricles into the atria. We can see here the atrioventricular valves located between atria and ventricles are going to allow the blood to flow from atria into ventricles, but not in the opposite direction. Let's take a look at the second set of valves, and these are called the semilunar valves. The semilunar valves are found at the base of each of the large arteries that carry the blood away from the heart. And so here in this pulmonary artery, which is also referred to as the pulmonary trunk, so this is the part of the artery prior to it branching to go to the left and the right lung. So right at the base, they cut it open here so we can see that, is what we call the pulmonary semilunar valve. And here at the base of this large artery called the aorta, we can see the aortic semilunar valve. And again, the point is to keep the blood flowing in one direction. So think of both the right ventricle and the left ventricle squeezing due to that muscle layer here contracting, and the pressure inside these chambers is getting bigger and bigger. So these valves have snapped shut, and now the pressure is big enough to move the blood out of the right ventricle. It will open up the semilunar valve, and the blood will flow through that pulmonary artery. Same thing is happening here at the left ventricle. That pressure increases. This valve AV valve is closed, so no blood goes into the atrium. Instead, it gets directed here to the base of the aorta. The pressure opens up that semilunar, and now the blood makes its way through the aorta and all of the branches so that it can be delivered to all the organ systems. So when the heart muscle here now starts to relax, and that's what happens when we have a heartbeat, it contracts and then relaxes, the pressure inside these chambers starts to decrease. And when that happens, the blood in these large arteries begins to roll back. We don't want the blood to roll from the aorta back into the left ventricle or from the pulmonary artery back into the right ventricle. So as that blood starts to roll back, that's the signal for the semilunar valves to snap shut and prevent the regurgitation or the backflow of that blood. So the semilunar valves located in the base of that pulmonary artery and aorta, the large arteries that carry blood away from the heart, are there to allow the blood to flow from the ventricles into those large arteries, but not in the opposite direction. It does not, it prevents, right, backflow of blood from those large arteries back into the ventricles. And this picture is just reminding you of the two circuits of the cardiovascular system, the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit. And again, if we divide this heart in two and we look at the right side of the heart, the right side is going to take that blood low in oxygen and pump it through this pulmonary trunk, which branches to the left and to the right lung. As the blood passes through the capillary networks in the lungs, it picks up oxygen, and we can see that denoted here by the color change. And so now it's they use the red as opposed to the blue, and this blood is now returned to the left side of the heart through those pulmonary veins. And so it now enters the systemic circuit, and now the left side of the heart is going to pump that blood away from the heart through the aorta, as you can see here, going to all the different systems up above or the systems in the lower half of the body. And again, in both instances, as the blood flows through the capillaries, the oxygen diffuses out to the surrounding tissues that need it. And what gets returned back to the heart is blood low in oxygen. And which side of the heart? That blood will flow back to the right side and now become part of the pulmonary circuit. And if everything is working properly the way it should, blood enters both the systemic and pulmonary circuits at the same time. And in fact, the same volume of blood enters the atria, moves to the ventricles, and then out those large arteries. That is your review. That is your tutorial of blood flow through the heart and the importance of those 4 valves. I hope you'll check out our websites or send us an email if you have any questions or comments. And if you find these helpful, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you.